appears, first of all, as small reddish spots on the skin. And it gradually will spread till it covers the entire body. There will be things like the joints of the fingers falling off, loss of ears or nose to that. And eventually, the person is going to die of that disease. And it's very gruesome and a very painful and horrible thing for a person to have to go through. The man in this particular miracle that we're talking about here is described by Luke as one who was full of leprosy. And remember now that Luke, being a doctor, he pays more attention to things like this maybe than some of the other writers would. And being full of leprosy, maybe here the man has been completely covered with the leprosy. It's spread now all over his body. He hasn't yet gotten to the point of losing joints and so forth, but still very clearly man has that. And so he's in a situation where he would not have maybe very long to live. The certainty of it is true. And so he comes to Jesus. When he comes, he expresses some doubt in his mind about this. He begins by saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. His doubt is not in the ability or the power of Jesus to heal him, but rather his doubt is in whether or not this is the will of Jesus. Jesus did not heal everybody that was sick. None of those among the apostles and others who were given miraculous powers to heal did not choose to always heal people. There were certain ones that Paul talks about that were sick, but he didn't heal them. It wasn't the will of God to do that. So this man doesn't really know if this is God's will or not, but he does know if it is the will of Jesus to heal him, he can heal him. And so he says he has that doubt, but also expresses his confidence in him, and Jesus did heal him. We mentioned the fact last week, the compassion that Christ showed for this man. The compassion not just in choosing to heal him, but his compassion in actually touching the man. Now, that was not necessary to do. We're going to see a little later of Jesus healing the servant of the centurion who is some distance away. He did not have to be present to heal them. He didn't have to touch them to heal them. But he chooses to touch this man. Now, why would he do that? In touching someone who has leprosy, and by the way, sometimes when the Old Testament talks about leprosy, it's not always this fatal disease. It's any kind of eruption on the skin that a person might have, that if it's oozing of any kind, it would be classified as leprosy, and contact with someone like that made you ceremonially unclean. And generally that took 7 days of purification in order to be clean, to be out among people again. But in touching this man, Jesus would make himself ceremonially unclean. And so again, the fact he's doing it is to show his compassion for this man. Lord, if you're willing, you can make me whole. And to show the love that he has for this man and his mercy, he touches him to provide that healing for him. Then the next thing, this is where we really won't begin tonight with it, hadn't got to this point, talk about it. But Jesus said to this man here, tell no one, what's happened. Reading here in the passage about that at verse 4, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to the people. Jesus doesn't want this man telling anybody about the healing. Now, why would that be the case? Why would he be reluctant to have anybody go and tell about this? All right. Yeah, he didn't want, on those occasions he says, my hour is not come, meaning the time of his death and so forth. He's going to reveal himself in that. But what another reason why? He doesn't want word spread about what he's done. Okay, people are going to flock to him, and that's going to interrupt his main job and responsibility, and that is of teaching the people. And we're going to see that's going to happen. When this man goes out and does tell people about what's happened, then all of a sudden multitudes come to Jesus, and they're coming to him to be healed. They're going to bring everybody they know that has any kind of physical problem, bring them to Jesus to be healed. And that's going to keep Jesus from being able to teach the people the way that he wants to do. So he's asked him not to do it. The man has one responsibility, and that's to go show himself to the priest. This is a requirement given under that law, under the Old Testament, two verses. First of all, Leviticus 13 and verse 9. It says, when the leprous sore is on a person, then he should be brought to the priest. This is initially. He goes to the priest when that sore appears, and then it becomes the responsibility of the priest to look at him, and the priest will determine whether or not this is leprosy, and whether or not the man needs to be separated from others, and whether or not he'll have to undergo certain requirements of the law. But the second passage in chapter 14 in verses 2 to 4, this is for a person who's been cleansed of leprosy. Then shall be the law of this shall be the law of the leper for the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall examine him, and indeed if the leprosy is healed in the leper, then the priest shall command to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 living and clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet, and hyssop, and goes on the sacrifice you'll have to make. So if you've been cleansed of leprosy, your first responsibility is to go to the priest and then make the sacrifice that's being required of that. And that's exactly what Jesus tells this man to do. Go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to the people. So here's the first miracle we're looking at here, the cleansing of a man who is full of leprosy. At the point of death, and that is that it's reached that point where it's certain he's going to die, that this is the disease that kills, and so he is brought to Christ and is healed by him. Now, I want to notice just very quickly a comparison that can be made between the leper and the sinner. The man who is afflicted with leprosy and the individual who is afflicted with sin in his life. And so just to look at a comparison of this, first of all, the leper, that's a disease that will kill. The man that had the disease of leprosy here had a disease that would kill him. And he's aware of that. And he knows his only hope is if he can find the miraculous power of God to heal him. But the same thing is true with the spiritual disease of sin, because it's a sin that will destroy. It'll kill not the body but the soul of man eternally. And so both are in a situation where they need healing that can be provided. The problem was in that day and time, man had no cure for leprosy. That's why lepers were simply separated from everybody else so as not to spread the disease. And being separate from everybody else, they're there at that place where all have the same disease and all of them are going to die. The same thing's true, though, with sin. No man had a cure for sin. It couldn't be provided. Talked about this before, but when you just study through the Bible about sin and about the reaction of it that people had, you know, that God did not immediately send His Son to provide the healing for sin. And I think one of the reasons why was to impress upon men that they couldn't come up with a solution themselves. We've talked about this before, but as soon as Adam sinned, if God had come to him and said, okay, Adam, you've sinned, you've separated yourself, you know, by your sin from me, you're now condemned eternally for that. What are you going to do about it? What's the solution? And Adam, just like any one of us, wouldn't have any idea what to do. But God wanted to impress upon man, man could not heal himself of sin. No man could be able to do that. It was just like the sin or the disease of leprosy. Thirdly, Jesus could cure the disease of leprosy. Nobody else could, but He could. But the same thing is true in regard to sin. No man can cure us of our sin, but Christ can. He has the ability to remove that sin from our lives. And then the final thing is, Jesus spoke the word and the man was healed. He touched the man, but He didn't have to do that. He had the power in the words that He spoke to provide that healing. Now, the same thing is true in regard to sin. In this sense, today the Word, that's the Bible, must be taught and obeyed before one can be healed of his sin. The Word still has to be applied. Man has to know what God has said in regard to the forgiveness of sins, and he has to be obedient to that Word in order that he might be forgiven. So, a lot of comparisons, I think, can be made between this man with his leprosy and those who are involved in sin. Now, the next thing we have, the next miracle, is the healing of a centurion servant. And, you know, this is one of those miracles that, you know, there's so much said about it, not just in the miracle itself, but in this man, the centurion, and about the servant that he has that needs that healing. As you look at it here in these few verses Matthew 8, verses 5 to 13, and the reading on the screen is from the New King James. Now when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, Lord, my servant is lying at home, paralyzed, dreadfully tormented. And Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard it, he marveled, and said to those who followed, Assuredly, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, Go your way, and as you have believed, so let it be done for you. And his servant was healed that same hour. So as we began looking at this, now I'm going to talk about a centurion. A centurion is a soldier who's over 100 men. I've heard some people in the military say he's kind of like that master sergeant or somebody. But he is in a position of authority and rule. Now, I have a great appreciation for everyone that's ever served in the military. I've never done so, and I don't know if I could have survived doing it, but I have a great appreciation for those who have served and for what they've done for us as a nation, and what I feel is a personal thanksgiving to those individuals served. But sometimes, when you think about men like this, you think about a centurion in that Roman army, what kind of a person you generally think of them as being? Callous. You're in a situation where being in a soldier, and the Romans back then especially, there were so many times that they were involved in wars because they've conquered the entire world. And they're constantly having to go to put down troubles in all these different places. And eventually that's going to happen here in Jerusalem. The city's going to be destroyed by those Roman soldiers. And so they can be a very callous people, very brutal, and think nothing at all about killing someone or whatever is necessary in battle to destroy. But every time we read about centurions in the New Testament, it seems like that every time they are people who are presented to us in a good light. Their qualities about it. And this man is no different. There's a number of good qualities we see in this man. And the first thing that I want us to notice is he loved his slave. Now, that's not what is told us here in Matthew, but in Luke's account, he does talk about this love that he has for his slave that he has. Let me see if I can find that. I think I wrote it down here for me. Well, I thought I'd written it down for him. But he talks about he loved his servant. And that in itself is kind of unique. A servant or a slave, what was the life of a slave like in the first century? What kind of rights and responsibilities did they have? They didn't have any. Yeah, he had to do whatever his master told him to do, and he had no rights. What could the master do to his slave? Whatever he wanted. They could be put to death. A slave back then was considered simply to be property that someone owned, and they had no rights. And, William Barclay especially records in one of his commentaries, he talks about, different examples from history of what was done to slaves. One slave had dropped and broke his master's favorite cup that he had, and broke it. And so the master had him thrown in this pond with these fish that destroyed him. I don't know what they were, but the man died as a result of that. You think about, well, that's kind of a harsh punishment for somebody breaking a cup. But, back then, that's what you could do to a slave. He had no rights, and the master could do whatever he wanted to. And so there was not always that kind feeling that they would have toward them. But this centurion loved this particular slave that he had. And, okay, Luke 7, all right, read that for me, please. All right, who was dear to him. What translation is that? New King James. Let me see what this one was. One of the ones that I'd read talked about him being, that he loved him. But that marks the idea of love their nation. That was the second thing here that I want to put. He loved the Jewish nation. Now, we kind of talked about some of this before, but many times most of the Jews were hated by the Romans, just like the Jews hated the Romans. And we talked about this, how that the Romans generally looked at the Jewish people and thought about them as, these are a group of people who are stubborn, they're hard-headed. You can't get them to do anything. And, they just had no good feelings toward the Jewish people at all. And like I said, eventually they're going to destroy the city of Jerusalem. They've already conquered them and had them serving under them. And so there wasn't a great deal of love for them. But this man did love the Jewish nation. And he had proven his love. What did he do to prove his love? He built them a synagogue. He built them a place to worship God. Now that's really intriguing to me, because the Jews believe there's just that one God, Jehovah, and yet here's Rome, and they worship thousands of different idols that they had, and so they, generally speaking, didn't think much of the gods of those nations they had conquered. Well, if we conquered you, your God can't be very much, because he didn't protect you. But here's an instance where this man loved the Jewish nation, and he built them a synagogue where they could gather to worship their God. And that's extremely important. Talk about this man, the type of individual that he was. Luke 7:5, for he loves our nation and has built us a synagogue. Again, it speaks highly of the type person. But thirdly, he's a humble person. You remember when servants had been sent to Jesus, and the servants that are sent were those who were elders among the Jewish people. And they come to Jesus, tell Jesus about this man and his servant that is sick. And the statement to Jesus is, he is worthy that you should do this for him. And then they go on to say, for he's loved our nation and built us a synagogue. The Jews said, this man is worthy of your helping him in this way. And yet when Jesus starts to come to the man, what did this centurion say? He sent servants to Jesus. What did he tell them? I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy for you to come under the roof of my house. So that shows the humility that this man had. Now again, that's not necessarily the thing you expect to find in a centurion. He's a man who's in authority. He's used to commanding people, and you do what I tell you to do. And he's not very humble in his presentation and the way he serves in that regard. But this man shows his humility that he has. So there's a lot of great things about this man here. John chapter 4, 1 and 2 says, therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard, and I'm kind of ahead of himself. I want to come to that. But here's the point of it. Look at what it says here in Matthew in regard to this man and his help that he needs from Jesus. A centurion came forward to him, beseeching him and saying, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home in terrible distress. In Matthew, he has the centurion coming to Jesus and personally asking Jesus for help. But in the other accounts that were given, who is it that comes to Jesus? Yeah, the Jewish leaders. It's not the centurion himself doesn't come to Jesus. He sends these others to do it. But now, So I bring this up because some people say, well, look, here's one of those contradictions you have in the Bible. Matthew says the centurion came to Jesus personally, and the other accounts say, no, he sent Jewish leaders to speak to Jesus on his behalf. But any time a man who is in command charges someone else to do something, their carrying out that action is attributed to the one who commanded them. And this was the example I wanted to look at in John 4, 1 and 2. It says, therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself did not baptize, but his disciples. The statement is made that Jesus has made and baptized more disciples than John. But then it very quickly tells us, but Jesus didn't baptize them. His disciples did that. But his disciples did that at the command of Jesus. And so this centurion evidently had commanded these people to go and speak to Jesus on his behalf, and so Matthew attributes it to his work. This is what he has done. He's responsible for that. The centurion also was a man of great faith. And this is the thing that's really brought out here, I think, in Matthew's account, and especially so as Jesus thinks about it, the great faith that this man had. Jesus was amazed at the great faith that he had. And it's not hard to understand when you read about the faith that this man had and how he explains these things to Jesus. He said, I'm not worthy for you to come into my house. But Lord, speak the word, and my servant will be healed. Because he says, I'm a man of authority, and I have those under me. And if I say to one man, come, he comes. To another one, go, and he goes. If I tell one servant, do this, he does it. He said, I know what it's like to have that authority and to be able to command and know people are going to do what I've told them to do. Well, there are a lot of people that have that kind of authority. Every centurion would have had that kind of authority. Every Roman captain would have had that kind of authority. So many people in political positions of power have that kind of power and authority. But with Jesus, his power and his authority is far greater than that. Because he's convinced that Jesus can say to a disease, be gone, and it'll go. He not only can command men, he can command the disease that a person has, and he can cause it to go. He has authority over everything. And the Bible says that Jesus was amazed when he heard that. Because he said to his own disciples, he said, I haven't seen such great faith, no, not in all Israel. Here's a nation of people who are the people of God. They're the chosen ones of God. They're the ones to whom God has given his law, the ones to whom God has sent his prophets. And for hundreds of years they have been taught and instructed by God. They've been led by God. They've been blessed by God. But Jesus said, I can't find anybody in the nation of Israel that has the kind of faith that this centurion has. He's a Gentile. He doesn't know what you know about Jehovah God. He's never experienced the blessings that you have experienced by God and all that he's done for the Jewish nation. But yet look at the faith that he has in Jesus. That all you've got to do, it's not necessary for you to even come. All you've got to do is speak the word, and my servant will be healed. Now, there are only 2 times in the Bible where it is said that Jesus was amazed or he marveled. This is one of them. Jesus was amazed at the great faith that this man had. The other time is mentioned, Mark 6:6. And he marveled because of their unbelief. Then he went about the villages in a circuit teaching. So 2 times you read about Jesus being amazed in the Bible. One time he's amazed at the lack of faith that the Jews had in him. The other time he is amazed at a Gentile who has such great faith in him. Now, it would be good for us, I think, in our lives sometimes just to stop and think, what kind of faith do I really have in God? You read about faith in the Bible. There are those who have little faith. There are some that have a dead faith. There are some that have great faith. What kind of faith do we have? We who are the people of God, what kind of faith we have. And it's fearful to think that we might be like those Jews whom Jesus would be amazed at how little faith we have. And yet someone that doesn't have all the advantages that these Jews had has the great faith in God. Next, the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. Chapter 8, verses 14 to 17. Now, several things about this, but as I think about it, now Jesus has we just looked at two instances where Jesus has provided miracles. But there have been others. And look at the other accounts. Other times prior to this, Jesus has healed certain people. So he finally comes to Peter's home, to the home of his mother-in-law, and maybe Jesus is thinking, here I can have some rest. But when he comes to that home, he finds that Peter's mother-in-law is sick. Now, when Jesus had come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother lying sick with a fever, so he touched her hand, and the fever left her. And she arose and served them. When the evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, He himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. All that he's done. Comes into Peter's home, maybe thinking he'll have a chance to rest a little bit. But as soon as he gets there, he finds that Peter's mother-in-law is sick. And he takes time to heal her. Touching her hand, and the fever leaves her. There were 3 different kinds of fever in that region of the world. We're not sure what she has been afflicted with, but 3 different kinds. One, Malta fever, that's mentioned sometimes, and we know that this is the type of fever that a person has that, well, let me read exactly what had been said about it. This is the type of fever where a person might experience weakness, anemia, and a wasting away that can last for months, and it can end in death. We don't know if this is what she had or not, but that's one type of fever that they had in that area. Then there were the different intermittent fevers that a person might have that, you might have it for a while and you get over it and you think everything's all right, and then sometimes later it hits you again. And that might happen several times that you'd have something like that. Then there was malaria, which is very common. And malaria is something that can come back like that intermittently. But malaria can be a dangerous disease. It can kill. So we don't know what she had, but she had some type of fever, maybe something along the line of this. And yet Jesus can touch her, and immediately by his touch, she's healed of that fever, whatever it is. Now, here's the thing that's interesting to me about this. What did this woman do when Jesus healed her? She got up and started serving them. Now, usually you think, somebody that's sick, we want to do what we can to help them out, and do whatever work we can. And even when they're recovered from that, we think, well, they're going to still need some help, and we need to do that. We don't think about them getting up and serving others. We think about maybe they need to be served. But Peter's mother-in-law gets up and starts serving them. Now, I think there's a lesson that we can learn from that from the spiritual side. All of us have been guilty of sin. We talk about that like leprosy. And we had an affliction of sin that can destroy us eternally. And yet Christ has come and he's healed us of that. And we've been forgiven of those sins. So what should we do? We need to rise up and serve. Like this woman, we need to get up and start serving others. I mean, that's the reason Jesus has called us to be a part of his family, to be a part of his kingdom. And that's the reason, that his love and all that's forgiven us that sins. But it's with the intention that we should begin serving Christ and serving one another and serving others we can. I don't know how many times here recently, I've heard this passage mentioned there from Ephesians that we were created in Christ Jesus for good works. God expects us to be involved in that and doing all the good that we can. And so here's this woman shows by example that she's healed from this fever, whatever it is, and immediately she gets up and starts serving. And so, I don't think we have an excuse for not in serving other people as we should, as God would intend for us to do that. That we want to be, again, serving others. Now, there will be some miracles that have been coming up that Christ is going to talk about. But first of all, I want to look to this, get past this, the cost of discipleship. Because before we get on to those others that the Bible's going to talk about, he talks about this need of recognizing the cost of discipleship. Beginning at verse 18 in that chapter, and going to verse 22. And I'm not sure if I put that on here or not. No, I didn't. Someone read that, verses 18 through 22 for us. Darnell, could you read that? Chapter 8, verses 18 to 22. There's a cross to be paid. I mean, there's a price to be paid of bearing our own cross like Jesus. And so Jesus is warning these two men who've come to him, they need to be willing to count the cost before you make a quick decision. And we have to do the same thing today. Talked about this before, but many times when we be down in Belize studying with people, and the people of Belize are beautiful people, but sometimes, they're so, eager to please that they're very willingly, agree sometimes to be baptized. And so what we would do sometimes after we've taught them and they say, yeah, they want to be baptized, we start saying, now here's what this means. If you're going to carry through this and you're going to become a child of God, here's what that means for your life. Here's what's going to be expected of you. Calvert Linares, the first deaf person we converted down there, Calvert was working for the Catholic Church. He was teaching a deaf school that the Catholic Church had down there. And so when he wanted to be baptized, I told him, I said, now, Calvert, I said, here's what's going to happen. If you carry through with this and you're baptized, and you begin worshiping with us down there on Magazine Road at the Church of Christ, you're going to lose your job. The Catholics are not going to want somebody from another religion teaching their students. And he said, I understand that. I know I won't have that job. And Calvert, you can't back down there to the Catholic Church and continue worshiping with them. You've got to come up here. That's what you're vowing to do. He said, yes, I know that. And I was surprised when he was still willing to do it, because a lot of times there are people who won't. But I think that's what Jesus is doing here. He wants these people who seem so eager to follow him to say, I understand what it means now if you're going to do that. There is a cost to be paid if you're going to do that. And he begins by saying to them, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. What do you think he's telling those people? It's not going to be easy. Jesus is not a rich man. Number one, I'm not going to be able to take care of your financial problems you have. Your following me is not going to mean suddenly that you're going to receive all these blessings of wealth. I don't even have a place to stay. The foxes and the birds, they have a place, but I don't. And so he wants them to understand that. Be careful in making that decision. There is a cross to bear. And he tells them, in the other accounts, you've got to be willing to take up your cross and follow me. Then another of the disciples said, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead. Lord, I want to follow you. Wherever you go, I want to go. But first of all, let me go home and bury my father. And Jesus, let the dead bury the dead. that sounds kind of cruel, doesn't it? I mean, a man loses his father, and he wants to show that respect, to bury his father, and yet Jesus seems to be saying, no, you let the dead do that. You come follow me. But it may be what this man is saying when he says, Lord, let me go first and bury my father. He may be saying, let me go back home, and whenever my father dies, and I mean, his father may not even be sick, his father may have years and years yet to live, but let me go home and be there with my father, and when he dies, and I can bury him, then I'll come follow you. Jesus said, let the dead bury the dead. Now, who are the dead to bury the dead? The unbelievers. He may be talking about those that are dead spiritually, those that are not following Christ. You let them take care of that work, but you have a work. If you're going to be following me, you have a work you need to be doing for me. And that work is going to be for him. He's going to be sending his disciples out to teach other people and encourage them to become obedient to God. So you take care of that. But you let those people who have chosen not to follow me, you let them take care of that work. But you need to be responsible for my work. So come and follow me. But there's a price to be paid, and you've got to be willing to do that. And if you're not, don't be claiming you're going to follow me wherever I go. Because a lot of people start off doing that, and then they see where he's going. They don't do it. It's going to happen. In the book of John, you've got multitudes of people that are following Jesus. And when Jesus begins talking about what's going to happen to him, and the disciples begin to remember, hey, this is a hard saying that you're giving. This is going to be hard to do. And then the text says, from that time forth, many of them went back and walked no more with him. When some people begin to see the price paid, what's going to be required of them, they make the choice not to go on. They don't want to do that. And so you've got to be willing to do that. And so simply a warning to them to be willing to pay the price. Now, he doesn't tell us. That may be left up to us. It's kind of like in Luke 15 when the prodigal comes home and the older brother stands outside, bitter, won't even go in. So his father comes out and talks to him and explains to him why we need to do this. But Jesus doesn't tell us, what about that older brother? Did he stay outside, or did he come to the house like his father asked him to do and welcome his brother home? And maybe the reason Jesus didn't tell us is because the answer lies with us. How are we going to react to that prodigal that comes home? And how are we going to react? If we're in that situation, now, we're going to have to determine, who are we going to, what are we going to do in this situation? Are we going to be willing to pay the price that it takes to follow Jesus, or are we not? And maybe we have to give the answer ourselves in that. As to what these two men did. But with that out of the way, immediately Matthew goes back to miracles that Jesus has done. So many being given here. We've got the stilling of the storm, demons being cast out of a person, and of a paralytic who's healed and forgiven. And it goes on and on and on, several of them he gives. Matthew 10:38, we've been talking about, he does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. If we're not willing to bear the cross, we're not worthy of Christ. And again, Luke's account of it, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Part of the cost. Christ has got to be first in your life above all else. More important to you than your family. More important to you even than your own life. That you've got to be willing to follow him. For some reason that's going backwards there. All right. Yeah, here we go. Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 through 37. I'm not going to read all of that right now. Just look at some of this. But this miracle is especially important And I think for two different reasons. But we'll look at this beginning at verse 23. And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him, and behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but he was asleep. And they went and woke him, saying, Save, Lord, we are perishing. And he said to them, Why are you afraid, O men of little faith? Then he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, What sort of man is this, that even winds and sea obey him? Like I said, two important reasons why this miracle ought to be important. Number one, it proves that Jesus is God. And we're going to look at some passages in just a minute. If we have time, we only got about a minute or so to go. The Jews understood that only God has power over weather, over nature in general. And yet here comes Jesus, and he shows his power over it. This storm arises, and he's able to calm that storm, those great waves and seas there. But here's the thing I want to mention. We'll say more about the Lord willing next week. But I just want to mention this. Jesus, first of all, said to them, Why are you afraid, O men of little faith? Now, Jesus is going to rebuke that storm. He's going to make it cease and make it be calm for them. But before he rebukes the storm, he rebukes his own disciples. And he rebukes them because of their little faith. Now remember, we talked about, that centurion has great faith, unlike anything he's seen in all Israel. And now here are his own disciples, and they evidence a little faith. And so he rebukes them before he rebukes the waves. And sometimes I think it may be that God sees the necessity of having to rebuke us before he rebukes the problems we're having in life, because we have such little faith in him. But our time's gone. We want to start at this point next week, Lord willing, and talk about this miracle and look at it in detail as to what Jesus has done, how that proves that he's the Son of God. Let's close with a brief word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Father, again, we thank thee for the time we've had to come together to be here and to study from your word, and we pray you'll dismiss us in your care and safety and help us to continue, Father, daily in our lives to look to your word and to see how we need to live and how we need to work to improve our lives, that we might bring glory and honor to thee, and that we might have that positive influence upon other people that would cause them to see Christ in us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.